Camera speed.
Sound production, take one.
Action!
Welcome to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign. If you love old movies, Hollywood history, or the golden age of filmmaking, you've come to the right place. This is the podcast that talks about amazing stories of Tinseltown from another era. Hear fascinating conversations with writer-producer Steve Cubine, who quite literally lives just beneath the Hollywood sign, and actress-writer Nan McNamara. Now your hosts, Steve and Nan.
Hey everybody, welcome back. We're really excited. We've got a great show for you today. And to start off, B movies have always held a special place in my heart. I know a lot of people have asked me, Steve, what is a B movie?
Steve, what is a B movie?
Well, you know, it's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but it specifically in the olden days, it referred to a movie that was meant to be shown as the lesser known second half of a double feature at the movie theater. And it was similar to like the B-side of a record.
Okay.
You know, it's not...
That's a good way of describing it.
It's not the main thrust. It's sort of the secondary reason you're there. These B movies, they usually had lower budgets, they had grittier subject matters, and they usually starred kind of lesser actors who weren't necessarily considered top tier by their studios.
And some of them unrightfully so.
Yes, very unrightfully so. These B movies, they're often crime dramas and war pictures and westerns and these fantasy adventure movies with exotic locales that are filmed awkwardly on studio sound stages. So that's sort of, in a nutshell, what a B movie is. And I think my love for B movies started as a kid. On Saturday mornings, I would watch the Dialing for Dollar movies. Did you have that in Minnesota?
I don't think we had
I know we
that.
might have talked about this before.
I don't think we did, yeah.
Where I grew up, the Dialing for Dollar movies, it was kind of fun. They would show a great B movie with like Yvonne DiCarlo or Maria Montez or Sabu or Marie Windsor. But you could also win cash if the host pulled out your phone number from this big tumbling barrel that was filled with cut up pages from the phone book.
Oh.
And if you were home when they called and could say, I'm watching the show, you'd win a prize.
So like, what, $5 or something?
I don't know. I wonder what the prizes were back then.
Yeah,
but I just thought it was so exciting. I just kept waiting for
Did
us
they
to
ever
be
call,
called.
Steve?
They never called. But it introduced me to B movies, and I really fell in love with them. And these B movies had these great leading men. Mm-hmm. They were studly and sturdy and reliable actors. They may not have been Gary Cooper or CARY GRANT or Clark Gable, but you know, they were certainly handsome and talented, and they knew how to beat up the bad guy and how to win over the lovely leading lady.
Yes.
So what's not to love?
Right.
So today we're going to do an homage to some kind of forgotten B leading men, and they're just actors that we love, and we just wanted to kind of highlight and tell you a little bit about their careers and their lives.
All right, so let's kick it off.
Kick it.
With the very handsome and sexy John Hodiak.
Yes. You know, John Hodiak was an interesting fella. Very Clark Gable-esque.
Very cool. Now, I can't remember. Was he on our Clark Gable lookalike
He was,
list?
And we didn't talk about him.
Okay, so good. We can talk
had to
about him
trim
now.
it, so we ended up not talking about him. But he was definitely considered sort of a threat to Clark Gable back in the day. But, you know, he was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was raised in this small blue-collar town in Michigan. Starting his life out, he worked as a caddy at a golf course, and then he worked at the Chevrolet automotive plant before moving to Chicago, where he broke into radio.
Right.
You know, when he did get his big break in radio, he actually created the role of the iconic comic strip character Lil Abner in Lil Abner. Yeah, which is so cool.
Now, when did he make the move out to Hollywood?
Well, you know, he was spotted. It seems like everybody was spotted by a talent scout back then. He was noticed by this MGM talent agent named Marvin Schneck, who signed him to a contract in 1942.
And he famously refused to change his name.
Which I kind of love that about him.
I do too.
He was very proud of his Ukraine and Polish ancestry. Mm-hmm. And he said, I like my name. It sounds like I look. And he was right, you know? Also an interesting thing, because he came to Hollywood in 1942, he was unable to serve in the war due to high blood pressure and a couple of other medical issues.
Right.
So he was one of those good-looking, talented leading men who got to fill in while all the main stars went off to war.
Right.
So it probably benefited his career not to be going to war. When he got to MGM, they gave him a couple of small roles. One of them's in an Ann Southern Maisie movie, but then they ended up liking him so much, they then cast him as her love interest in Maisie Goes to Rio in 1944.
Okay.
Which is what really got him started. And he floundered for a while in small parts at MGM before he finally gained a little attention when he was cast as Lana Turner's soldier husband in Marriage is a Private Affair in 1944.
Wow. Well, Alfred Hitchcock in that same year also takes notice of him and casts him in his film Lifeboat as Kovac, the crewman who finds himself sharing a lifeboat with, the likes of Tallulah Bankhead, William Bendix, Walter Slezak, Mary Anderson, Heather Angel, Hume Cronin, Henry Hall, and Canada Lee.
What a cast.
I know, right? It's really interesting, though, that he was loaned out for this film to Fox, as well as another film that we're going to talk about. And he really did better when he was outside of his contract with MGM.
Which was sometimes the case when your home studio doesn't know what to do with you. They loan you out, and my God, you hit, which is interesting.
His type of role was this sexy scoundrel.
Yes.
Who's a gambler or a gangster or a nightclub owner. I love how you describe this, who would often go straight for the right girl.
That so sums up his type.
Yes.
But he could also kind of play the straight-laced leading man, too. But whenever he had a little edge of scoundrel, he was at his best.
I think so, too.
And after he appeared in Lifeboat in the same year, 1944, he is cast in this sweet, sentimental film, Sunday Dinner for a Soldier, opposite Anne Baxter. Well, things must have gone really well with Anne Baxter because they ended up dating and eventually married in 1946. They would later divorce in 53, but for a while they were a hot Hollywood couple.
Right. There's another memorable performance that he gives in a movie called A Bell for Adano in 1945, which is available on YouTube. He plays a U.S. Army soldier overseeing a small Italian city during a raid on Sicily, and he replaces the town's long-lost belle and wins over the native girl, played by Jean Tierney.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I love that. I also love, and I revisited just sections of it last night, in 1946, The Harvey Girls with Judy Garland. That scene when she comes into the saloon to give him what for. Oh my gosh, he's just smoldering and she's just stunning. And the chemistry, I think, as you've noted, between the two of them is really something.
Yeah, they had great chemistry. I love them together.
And he's a gambler.
And he's a gambler.
And a saloon owner, I think, too.
Exactly, living up to his reputation.
Yeah.
He's also quite good as the amnesia victim trying to sort of piece back his life in a really kind of little-known movie called Somewhere in the Night, 1946. I only mention this because I actually watched it last night.
Oh, you did?
So it's sort of is fresh in my memory.
Yes.
And it was a really, really taut and clever film noir and quite the thriller. It also starred Richard Conte and Nancy Guild making her screen debut. He's really good in that.
Now, you have a favorite, though, that is coming up next.
I do have a favorite. I like a lot of his movies, but I have a special place in my heart for Desert Fury, 1947, where he plays the gangster Eddie Bendix, who romances Elizabeth Scott, who's the daughter of his old flame, Mary Astor, while being pursued by the local lawman played by Burt Lancaster.
What
First
a
of all,
cast.
that cast alone, you've got Hodiak, Elizabeth Scott, Mary Astor, Burt Lancaster. That is a film noir dream.
Yeah,
right
it
there.
is. It is.
But it's
Truly.
a great movie. I think it's available everywhere. So if you haven't seen that one, and it's in Technicolor. It's one of the very rare film noirs. It's in color.
Yeah.
Really great.
Now, John Hodiak's contract with MGM expires in 1951. And what does he do? He just goes off to New York and ends up making his Broadway debut, which is pretty impressive, in The Chase. And he actually wins the Donaldson Award for that. He follows that up by originating the role of Lieutenant Stephen Merrick opposite Henry Fonda in the original production of the Caine Mutiny Court-Martial.
And I've read that when they made the film version of the Caine Mutiny, he was devastated that his part went to Van Johnson.
Yes.
What a disappointment for him.
And what two totally different actors. I would have loved to have seen John Hodiak do that role.
Me too.
Well, his life and career is cut extremely short when at the age of 41, he dies of a massive heart attack. Which could very well be related to the high blood pressure which kept him out of World War II.
It makes you wonder.
It does.
But a really wonderful actor who's really worth rediscovering.
Yeah, and we'll put in the show notes the films that we mentioned. All right, let's jump into one of my favorite guys, Robert Cummings.
Yes. How about that Bob?
How about that, Bob? Robert Bob Cummings was born in 1908, although he later might have shaved off a couple of years, and said he was born in 1910. In Joplin, Missouri, his mother was a minister, which I find really interesting to have your mother be a minister.
I know.
His father was a doctor. And Cummings actually credits his father with a way of eating back in those days that helped him maintain his youth and vigor. He has one of the funniest stories, though, about how he got into the business.
Yes.
So he went to New York, right? He went to Carnegie Tech, he went to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, and he tells this story of starting out in New York. The majority of the plays on Broadway at the time were British plays, starring British actors. He could not get a job. So he ends up taking a job on the Cunard Cruise Line. He sets sail to Europe. He buys a round-trip ticket. He gets to England. He learns the accent. He changes his name to Blade Stanhope Conway.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
It's quite a mouthful. He takes his picture in front of a marquee, makes duplicate copies, sends it back to the United States to all these people that can potentially get him work, and basically pulls off this feat that he's British now.
I know, and it totally worked.
It did.
You know, because I know back in New York, he started getting meetings, and he was eventually cast in the 1931 Broadway production of The Roof by John Galsworthy, using this fake name and pretending to be a Brit.
Right.
Which I think is fascinating.
I do too. Use it once, and that's amazing. But he actually did it again when he moved to Hollywood. He came to Hollywood and acquired a Southern drawl and changed his name again to Bryce Hutchins of Texas. I think that's amazing.
That is so good. Well, you know, you do what you got to do. Can I tell a little weird story?
Please.
The very first short film I ever wrote and directed, the lead actress, when we were auditioning actresses, this lovely woman came in, total Irish brogue. And I was like, oh, she's never going to work. She's an Irish girl. Well, she ended up doing a flawless American accent. I cast her. She was great. And then about a month after we wrapped the production, she called me up and took me to lunch, and she confessed to me that she has been faking her Irishness to get a leg up in Hollywood. She was from Arizona. Her name was nothing Irish, and she totally fooled everybody, including myself.
Wow. I didn't know that being Irish could get you a leg up. Why hasn't it worked for me?
You know, and I asked her that, and she said, you know, as I am now, I don't stand out in a crowd.
Okay.
But when you hear a lovely Irish brogue, you're going to remember me.
All right.
And, you know, it probably influenced me a little bit because her
Yes.
brogue was so lovely and she was so lovely. And I was like, so hey, it works.
All right,
So
I'm gonna
Bob knew what he was doing.
I'm going to start working on me brogue. Just a little quick side note about Bob. His original name is also interesting.
Yes.
He was born Charles Clarence Robert Orville Cummings. So maybe that's where this whole name thing came about. He was like, I had
some
5
kind
names.
of fixation about names.
Yes. Well, and he probably changed his name to Bryce Hutchins of Texas because he had heard about King Vidor looking for people from Texas for his film So Red the Rose in 1935, and sure enough, it worked.
And it worked. And, you know, it's funny because he pretended to have this Texas accent. He learned the accent from listening to cowboy bands on the radio. And Vidor finally figured out that he was not Texan, but he still thought he was great and kept him on board. And So Red the Rose was quite a success, and it really got him a long-term contract at Paramount.
I love his spunk.
Yeah, he was innovative.
Now, he also starred in 2 pictures with your friend, Marcia Hunt.
He did. And Marcia loved him. I've talked to her a couple of times about this. In 1935, he was in her film debut called The Virginia Judge. And they starred together also in 1936 in Hollywood Boulevard. She always told me that he was one of the funniest leading men she'd ever worked with, and she really had nothing but great things to say about him.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of his best films.
Oh, he made so many good films. I mean, you would be remiss if you didn't mention Sam Wood's King Row in 1941 with Ann Sheridan and Ronald Reagan.
Who he was friends with his entire life.
His entire life. And he also did 2 Alfred Hitchcock films, Saboteur, 1942, which I know we've talked about before because Hitchcock notoriously did not want him or co-star Priscilla Lane.
Right.
And he ended up casting him again in Dial M for Murder in 1954 with Grace Kelly and Ray Milland.
Yes, which is a great film. He also went on to a very prolific TV career. He starred in his own series, The Bob Cummings Show, in 1955 through 59, as well as My Living Doll in 1964 to 1965, with future Catwoman Julie Newmar. And I also think it's interesting that he wrote a book on nutrition called Stay Young and Vital. You can find it actually on Amazon. Amazon, a used copy of it. Although, to be completely transparent, there were some reported issues of drug addiction to methamphetamines, which many stars during the day had, as we've talked about on previous episodes.
They call them peppy pills.
Yeah, exactly. His film career spanned over 100 film credits, 3 sons, 4 daughters. How many wives?
5 wives. And he won an Emmy for, Studio One in 1955. He was Emmy nominated 4 or 5 times for his own show. So he had quite a career.
He really did. He did suffer from Parkinson's disease toward the end of his life. And on December 2nd, 1990, he died of kidney failure and complications from pneumonia at the motion picture home in Woodland Hills. I think it's time for our Hollywood pop quiz.
And the pop quiz today, and it's also about our B-leading man, and actually, it's about Bob Cummings.
Okay.
Bob Cummings notoriously went to England, adapted a British accent, changed his name, and it worked. Well, he had a really good actress friend who he encouraged to do the same thing.
Yes.
And she also studied, got the accent, changed her name, and for years and years and years, everyone thought she was a Brit, but she was actually born in Iowa. Who was the actress? Very well-known actress.
Well, we will have the answer to that and more about our B-leading men right after this.
All right, Steve and Ann will be right back, but first, another stop on the Hollywood tour. And this month is a perfect time to talk about film production in the summertime. Now, when you think summertime, you probably don't think about the holiday classic, It's a Wonderful Life, but you should, because George Bailey's Bleak Christmas Eve was actually shot during a series of 90-degree-plus days in June and July in 1946. It was on RKO's ranch in Encino, California. The days were so hot that Frank Capra gave the cast and crew multiple days off during filming just to recover from heat exhaustion. In fact, in that famous scene on the bridge, before he saves Clarence the Angel from the dark, swirling waters below, a suicidal George Bailey is clearly sweating. But it's Jimmy Stewart's wonderful acting that convinces us that fear and dread are the reason for that. Somewhere, an angel gets its wings and a trip to the beach. And now back to Steve and Ann from Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
Welcome back, everybody. We wanted to give a shout out to this week's Listener of the Week, Ruth Ferrara. Thank you so much for listening, Ruth. And I just wanted to also fess up that my Katharine Hepburn impression, I did misquote that line. I believe it's the calla lilies are in bloom again, such a strange flower. Not such a lovely flower.
Duly noted now.
Yes, okay.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you, Ruth. Let's dive into one of your favorites.
It's my boy, Dennis O'Keefe.
Right.
I love this actor. You know, if he'd never made another film in his career, after starring in the Anthony Mann-directed noir classics, T-Man from 1947 and Raw Deal 1948, he would have left such an indelible mark on the film industry that he would never have needed to make another movie.
Yeah.
Whether he was the good guy or the bad guy, he always brought this tough, misunderstood quality to his roles, but he was ultimately the tough guy with a heart of gold.
Now, those two films, T-Men and Raw Deal, were both co-written by the same team.
Yeah, and the same director.
And the same director,
So I'm sure they had a good thing going there.
And you can find Raw Deal right now on the Internet Archive, free.
Yeah. You know, in T-Man, he and Alfred Ryder play these U.S. Treasury agents who are infiltrating this counterfeit ring. And then in Raw Deal, he plays this escaped convict who's torn between tough cookie Claire Trevor and good girl Marcia Hunt.
Oh, yeah.
Great movie. Kind of getting back to O'Keefe and his beginnings, he was born in Iowa into a vaudeville family.
So he was on the stage at a very young age.
He was. He actually joined his parents' act and later wrote skits for them. You know, he did attend USC but was forced to leave during his sophomore year when his father died. But he continued his father's vaudeville act for several years after his father's death.
And he got a small break in an important film, Saratoga, 1937, with Clark Gable and Jean Harlow. And Gable is so impressed with him that he convinces, or at least helps, get him a contract at MGM.
Yeah, he did, which was, I don't think actors would do that much today, to go out of your way to help somebody. When he was at MGM, his time there was pretty unmemorable.
Okay.
You know, he did much better when he shifted over to Universal, and he did Topper Returns in 1941 with Roland Young and Joan Blondell and Carol Landis, who we talked about here.
Right.
He also had a showy part over at Paramount in the Cecil B. DeMille directed film The Story of Dr. Wassel in 1944, which was about the adventures of this doctor played by Gary Cooper during World War II. But probably one of my favorite films of his was also in 1944, and it's this charming, very funny movie called Up in Mabel's Room. It's where a woman's lingerie wreaks havoc for Dennis O'Keefe, his wife, played by Marjorie Reynolds, and his ex-girlfriend, played by Gail Patrick.
Yes.
Great cast.
Yeah, great cast. Well, he's in Brewster's Millions the following year with Gail Patrick again, 1945. And another podcast episode, we talked about Helen Walker.
Good old Helen, yeah.
Yeah, and
she's
June
great in
Havoc.
that movie, by the way.
Yeah, that's a good one.
He's also really good, and it's just so doesn't go with his character, because he does this musical called Dollface in 45 with Vivian Blaine and Carmen Miranda. And he's really good in it. He doesn't sing, though.
Okay.
And one of the cool things about Dennis O'Keefe was he always had a knack for writing, and he ended up co-writing the original screenplay for the B film Cover Up in 1949, which he starred in with William Bendix and Barbara Britton. He would continue writing throughout the 50s and 60s.
Well, it sounds like that vaudeville start in writing really helped him.
He learned his craft early with his
he
dad
did.
in vaudeville.
And what comes next for him?
He continued to do kind of B movies all through the 50s. One of my favorites is The Lady Wants Mink from 1953. Great movie, really funny, where he plays the husband of Ruth Hussey, who wants a mink coat.
Yes.
So what does Ruth do to get a mink coat? She raises real mink. The critters. What could possibly go wrong with that?
Right. Eve Arden co-stars in that as well, who I adore.
He ended up going to television, where he had the Dennis O'Keefe show on for a season. And then in the 1960s, he went to Broadway, where he stepped into the lead of the comedy Never Too Late opposite Martha Scott, which was about, of course, a middle-aged couple with adult children who discover they're having another baby.
Well, his career was also cut relatively short. He dies of lung cancer at the age of 60.
Yes, don't smoke, people.
No, don't smoke. Let's move on to William Lundigan.
William Lundigan.
Yes. Now, you first noticed him as the all-American boyfriend to Marion Hardy in a couple of the Andy Hardy films, played by Cecilia Parker in the 40s.
He was Marion's boyfriend in a couple of movies. And, and he really stood out. He was tall and built and blonde and handsome. He had all the prerequisites to portray every young girl's fantasy boyfriend.
And he had an interesting start as well. He was born in Syracuse, New York. He got his start on the radio. He graduated from law school and passed the bar exam. And as the story goes, he was reading a commercial on the radio. Head of production at Universal, Charles Rogers, hears him reading, likes his voice so much that he brought him to New York to test him for movies. Once again, don't my dulcet tones help me in any way?
It's all about the voice. I hope not, for my sake.
Well, sure enough, the talent scout lures him out to Hollywood. He signs with Universal Pictures, and he pretty much starts working right away.
Yeah, he really did. He showed kind of immediate promise in The Lady Fights Back in 1937, which starred Kent Taylor and Irene Hervey, and Three Smart Girls Grow Up in 1939 with the great Deanna Durbin. But his career really gained traction when he was signed by Warner Brothers to play a supporting role in The Old Maid, starring Betty Davis and, of course, her arch rival, Miriam Hopkins.
I love that the New York Times called him, I'm assuming it was during this time period, the male counterpart to the girl next door.
Yes.
So he had that kind of face.
kind of see that.
I can too.
He had a wholesomeness about him.
Yes.
Coming up next for Lundigan was Michael Curtiz's great hit Western Dodge City in 1939, where he played Olivia de Havilland's irresponsible brother. Well, he must have played it really, really well, because in 1940 he was cast again in Santa Fe Trail, once again playing Olivia de Havilland's brother.
How funny is that? 2 films back to back. I mean, that's nuts.
About that time, he gave an interview, and he was a little frustrated with where his career was, and he said, there's more to me than playing Olivia de Havilland's brother, so let me show you.
Now, he does do a great job in A Shot in the Dark in 1941, Apache Trail 1942, opposite Donna Reed.
After that, his career was interrupted when he enlisted in the the U.S. Marine Corps, and he served as a combat photographer. While serving, he was wounded but recovered, and when the war ended, he ended as a corporal, and he went back to Hollywood to resume his career and did fine. He got back into movies with like The Fabulous Dorseys in 47, which was about the career of musicians and band leaders Tommy Dorsey and his brother Jimmy.
Okay.
And he was also in The Inside Story, 1948, where he and Marcia Hunt, again, Marcia's everywhere,
right,
plays an artist and his fiancée who come across some stolen money.
Probably his most famous film is Elia Kazan's Pinky from 1949, which was originally supposed to be directed by John Ford.
Yes.
Now,
I think Ford got fired, if I'm not mistaken.
I think he did get fired.
Yes.
Yeah, I think he did. In Pinky, he plays Dr. Thomas Adams, with whom the title character, Pinky, Jean Crane, falls in love with. Now, this is just...
We've talked about this before with the whole Louise Reiner and The Good Earth. Why would you cast Jean Crane? Elia Kazan did not like Jean Crane and thought she was miscast, but why would you cast her when you've got Dorothy Dandridge and Lena Horne right there?
Right, because the premise of the film is Pinky is a black woman who is passing for white. Jean Crane is a white woman.
Yes.
And she should not have been playing that role, but times were different.
We know better now.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Around the same time, speaking of John Ford, he actually was in a revival of John Ford's theater production of What Price Glory, which starred Gregory Peck and Maureen O'Hara, and they ended up touring California.
How cool is that? What a cast.
Yeah. Pretty amazing.
You know, he's in a lot of really good movies. He's a great leading man to Dorothy McGuire in Mother Didn't Tell Me in 1950. He's opposite June Haver in I'll Get By, also 1950, and Love Nest, 1951. He also stars with Susan Hayward in I'll Climb the Highest Mountain, also 51. Another one that I just love, and it's very little known, he's the second lead in a great film noir thriller called The House on Telegraph Hill, also 1951. He was busy in 1951.
He was.
And that one starred Richard Basehart and Valentina Cortesa.
He also made the transition into television, had his own series.
Yeah, the series was Men into Space from 1959 to 60.
And he passed away on December 20th, 1975 from heart failure at the age of 61.
Still too young.
Too young, and most of these men have died young and of heart failure. So too much smoking and not enough of what we now know to be vegetables.
Yeah, and probably too much boozing.
Yeah, could be that as well.
Yeah.
This next gentleman I just love. This is Alan Marshall, and that's with one L, people.
It is. Don't make that mistake.
Yes. Now, Alan Marshall was born in Sydney, Australia. I thought all these years that he was a Brit.
Oh, me too. Totally thought he was a Brit.
And he was the son of well-known actors. The family actually relocated to America when Marshall was 5 years old. He got his start on Broadway. He's got half a dozen Broadway credits.
Yeah, he really learned his craft, I think, on the Broadway stage.
Yeah, he played the juvenile lead in The Bishop Misbehaves in 1935. Most of his credits on Broadway, the shows didn't run very long, but I think you're absolutely right. He was spotted again by a talent scout.
Yet again, one of those ubiquitous talent agents or talent scouts.
Right. They offer him a screen test at Selznick International Studios, and Selznick casts him in a supporting role in The Garden of Allah with none other than Marlene Dietrich and Charles Boyer in 1936.
And what a great start.
Yeah, right? That's a good sign.
Yeah, and right after that, they loaned him out to MGM, and he appeared in After the Thin Man in 1936, of course, with William Powell and Myrna Loy.
Yep.
And this led to another MGM film, Night Must Fall, in 1937, where he is cast as the second lead behind Robert Montgomery and Rosalind Russell.
I got to do that play in summer stock, and I don't think I've ever seen the film, so I have to see it.
You know, I've never seen the film
Yeah.
either. On our watch list.
All right, it's on the watch list. Now, he stayed at MGM, right? And was in some pretty big films.
Yeah, he was in Parnell, 1937, with Clark Gable and Myrna Loy. He's in Conquest, also in 37, with Greta Garbo and Charles Boyer. I mean, how much bigger does it get?
Yeah, and then he moves on to his first leading man role, which is really surprising to me because when you see him in film, you think, why is this guy not the leading man?
Yeah.
Well, finally he is in Republic Pictures' film Invisible Enemy in 1938. He returns to MGM with our friend Louise Reiner in Dramatic School in 1939, which also has a pretty impressive cast with Paulette Goddard, Lana Turner, Anne Rutherford.
Annie was in that one. Yes, she was.
Virginia Gray, and another favorite on this pod, Gail Sondergaard.
Yeah, what a cast.
Right around this time in 1938, he married San Francisco socialite Mary Grace Burrell, and they had a son, Christopher, who is also an actor. I love Alan and Mary's nicknames for each other. They called each other Binks and Buzz.
Oh,
I know.
That's so adorable. Alan Marshall continued to make way in Hollywood. He appeared in Four Girls in White in 1939, where he played a doctor who's in love with Florence Rice. And then a big role for him, he goes over to RKO and he appears in the John Farrow directed classic, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, also 1939. And he followed that up with a nice lead opposite Ginger Rogers in Tom, Dick, and Harry in 1940. The early 40s were pretty prolific for him. He supported Anna Nagel in Irene, 1940. He was with Loretta Young in He Stayed for Breakfast, also 1940. And what a great title.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That was over at Columbia. And then he was opposite Meryl Oberon in Lydia at United Artists in 1941.
So this is during the time of World War II. He was not able to enlist.
He wasn't a U.S. citizen.
Oh, that's right. Of course he was in Australia.
He never gave up his Australian citizenship,
Yes.
so he wasn't able to serve, which, as we've said about a couple of other actors, it probably served him well because he was left behind for the studios to use as a leading man.
Right. And one of those films was in the Clarence Brown directed The White Cliffs of Dover with the beautiful Irene Dunn.
Such a great movie.
Does she just make everybody better in
Yes.
every film?
Yes, she does.
Yeah, she's just delightful. Followed that up with the lead in Bride by Mistake in 1944, this time a comedy with Lorraine Day and Marsha Hunt. Man, that woman is...
All roads lead to Marsha.
I know, they really do. They really do. In the mid-1950s, Marshall actually suffers a nervous breakdown and didn't act for many years.
Yeah, right. He eventually returned to film work, but I don't think he got the parts he used to get. He mostly ended up in B movies and supporting roles. He did appear in a small role in The Opposite Sex in 1956, which is the musical remake of The Women,
Right.
which starred June Allison, Joan Collins, Dolores Gray, Ann Miller, and Ann Sheridan. And horror film fans know Alan Marshall from his supporting role in the cult classic House on Haunted Hill from 1959, which was, of course, directed by William Castle and starred Vincent Price.
Yes.
Alan Marshall's final film was one of my favorites. It's such a great movie. It's this tense and dramatic Western called Day of the Outlaw from 1959. It's just wonderful. It stars Robert Ryan and Burl Ives and Tina Louise. I know that sounds like a really odd cast.
like an interesting cast.
But it's so good. And Alan Marshall plays Tina Louise's husband, but Tina Louise is in love with Robert Ryan, and it's sort of a love triangle while all this other stuff is going on. It was directed by the great Andre de Toth, which would be his final film Western.
He did go on to do theater, and in fact, at the very young age of just 52 years old, he was playing opposite Mae West in Chicago, and in July 1961, he actually had a heart attack on stage. He finished the show, and the next morning was found dead in his bed.
Oh, so
It's
tragic.
so sad.
The show was Sextet, which of
Yes.
course went on to be a notorious bomb of a movie that Mae West did.
His wife, Mary, is buried with him in the same crypt. And there's a great website that I think we both feel his son Christopher put together, alan.kit Marshall, Marshal, 1L, .site. And it is full
Yes.
of wonderful details about Alan Marshall.
Yeah, it's just sort of a treasure trove of info about him and his career.
Well, there's just not enough time. There's so many more we could talk
many
about.
more.
Yes.
Now, we're going to have to do our favorite B leading ladies at
Yes,
some point.
we will indeed. But right now, it's time for the answer to our Hollywood pop quiz.
Yes, and the question was, of course, we all know that Bob Cummings changed his name, learned a British accent, faked being a Brit, got his start it got him his start in show business, but he actually encouraged one of his fellow acting friends to do the same thing. And she was this young actress from Iowa, and she did the same thing. She learned the British accent, she studied, she passed herself off as a Brit, and for years and years and years, everybody thought she was from Britain, and she was from Iowa. Who was she?
All right.
All right, well, she was. No guesses. It was Margaret Lindsay. So who out there always thought Margaret Lindsay was a Brit.
Well, now we know. Now we know. We have all the
Her
all the
cover
deets.
is busted.
Yeah, her cover is busted. Well, thanks everybody for listening. We would love it if you would follow us on social media and if you would give us a 5-star review. Our handle is @FromBeneathTheHollywood We are on Instagram, Facebook, and you can watch the podcast on YouTube.
And we love getting your emails. So email us any questions, any comments, any suggestions, or just let us know if you've ever faked an accent to get ahead in life. You can reach us at info@FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com.
That's this week's view.
From Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
You've been listening to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign with Steve Cubine and Nan McNamara, the podcast that celebrates amazing stories of Tinseltown from its golden era. Join us next week for another episode and learn something else about Hollywood you probably never knew. Take a moment and give us a 5-star rating and a positive review. And tell your friends about us too. It'll help grow the podcast. Visit Steve's website at FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com. The executive producers are Steve Cubine and Nan McNamara. Executive producer and post-production supervisor, Lindsay Schnebley. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows like The Box of Oddities and The Shallow End with Schnebley and Toth. Copyright 2024, all rights reserved. That's a wrap.